Welcome everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jordan Bondcore. I'm the project assistant working on the PNP campaign here at the GMSH. So nice to meet some of you and nice to see some familiar faces, and a very happy new year to everybody. Just a reminder, today is going to be a recorded webinar for folks who don't have a chance to participate. So this will be a recorded call. I want to thank you all for making the time to be here in your busy days. I know that this is a significant chunk of time to give up, but we appreciate you being here for what we think is such an important topic. I want to acknowledge to GMSH for hosting us and to my colleagues Chris and Eric for their support of this webinar. Yeah, so really excited to have this conversation with you. So before we get into the introductions and all the good stuff that we're here to do, it may seem like crystal meth has been a hot topic as of late, or to paraphrase Wendy Williams, it's a hot topic. But this has been an ongoing issue in our community for a number of years. I can think at least dating back to the early to mid 2000s, we've been talking about crystal meth over and over and over again. It's been a crisis, according to some in our community, but it's been a crisis without an apparent solution. Was prevention the answer? Was harm reduction the answer? Or should we just keep the status quo? And there's been a lot of sort of, inaction across the board for a number of years and some responses, but not necessarily a focused response. One of the things that was really absent during a lot of these discussions around crystal meth in our community was the voices of people who actually used crystal meth or were impacted by it, which is why I'm so excited today to be presenting, to have the presentation today on the Crystal Meth Project that was headed up by the CBRC and I believe University of Victoria. Kiffer will correct me if I'm wrong on the people that were behind that. But really, the first report that I've seen or project that I've seen that has really incorporated the lived experience and the voices of people who use crystal meth. And so I'm super excited by that. We finally get to hear from these people and the insight into what they need in terms of the services that we as service providers are offering, what makes them relevant, and how to do that job better. As a drug user and a crystal meth user specifically, I just want to thank Kiffer and his team who did this research for really elevating the voices in our community so we can benefit from that knowledge. As our webinar title kind of indicated, sometimes we can do harm when we fail to listen to those that we're trying to help, or when we fail to understand our own biases and preconceptions. And I think this report goes a long way to addressing that. I encourage everybody to keep an open mind and be curious, challenge your preconceptions, and reflect on how we can be of better service to guys who use crystal meth. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Eric Peters for the land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Jordan. Good afternoon, everyone. Since time immemorial, the land on which we live, work, study, and enjoy social and recreational privileges has been the home and traditional territory of Indigenous peoples. Our work goes across the many traditional territories of this land, now known as Ontario, which continues to be the home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, which include the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. By acknowledging this land, it represents an act of resistance against the continued erasure of Indigenous peoples and their rights. It demonstrates our relationship with the land, and it further recognizes that treaties were made and broken, and some were never made. Rights were stripped and denied by centuries of laws and policies. Let us keep in mind that colonization remains a key determinant factor, along with its ongoing social and health impacts that result in the health inequities faced by Indigenous peoples, and that ultimately contribute to the prevalence of COVID-19, HIV/AIDS, and underaddressed substance use in Indigenous communities. I encourage us all to do our part in addressing the ongoing injustices, as well as strive to connect our work with efforts to realize the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. While we look forward, it is also time to look back on the work done over the past year. I ask that we take a moment to remember those whom we have lost over the past year, not only to COVID-19 and HIV, but also the countless lives lost to the overdose crisis. Finally, as we embark on this new year with our work and in our daily lives, I call on you to join us at the GMSH with our commitment in addressing racial injustice and transphobia. Let us be reflective, self-critical, and open to learning and growing as part of that commitment, ensuring that we are hearing, processing, and acting upon feedback which are essential components of that commitment. Statements of solidarity alone are not remedial, and that efforts to address anti-Black racism and discriminatory practices against Indigenous people must include specific measurable objectives. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm going to turn things over to Chris to do a little bit of housekeeping with us.
Thank you, Jordan. And thank you all for joining us today. To prevent noise distractions, we've actually muted everybody. Unfortunately, there's sometimes background noise. A little bit of background noise goes a long way. So if you have a question at any point or would like to make a comment at any point during the presentation, please use the raise hand function, and it will order you in first come, first serve. To use that raise hand feature, you just need to go to either the bottom or the top of your screen, click on the participants icon at the bottom of the screen or the top, and that will open a window on the right. And in the lower right-hand corner, you will see a raise hand button. When it comes time for you to ask your question, I will unmute you, and then you can ask your question. And again, just so everybody is aware, we are recording this presentation for people who are unable to join us today. And if you do happen to encounter any technical issues during the presentation, please feel free to give me a call at the office, 416-364-4555 and extension 300. Thanks.
So much, Chris. So let's get to it. I'd like to introduce our panel today. We're going to do things a little differently. Instead of people giving their bio and where they work and all those details, we're going to ask them a question to get to know them a little bit better. So each of their panelists will give us their name, the organization that they're working with, and then I'd like them to answer this question, which is, how are you connected with GBTQ2S men who use crystal meth, and why is being here today important to you? So we've decided to start things off with Shafiq. Shafiq, if you'd like to take that away.
Hey there, my name is Shafiq Kamani. I'm a community member. I am a gay man who uses crystal meth and really challenged by the notion of that my two options are sobriety or rock bottom. While I feel like most of us live in the middle in those stages. And I think conversations about those stages and where we are really important. Sharing our stories are important. I think only through this venues like this that we'll be able to come up with solutions that work for us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And I think, is it Gavin next? Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I know a lot of people on this call, so it's great to see everyone. My name is Gavin Majimal. I am the Gay Men's Sexual Health Harm Reduction Coordinator at ACT, formerly known as the AIDS Committee of Toronto. And this discussion is important to me because through my work, I get the opportunity to connect with a variety of queer men who use crystal meth and other substances and are either seeking information or support around that on how to party safer or harm reduction strategies. And so I host a variety of programs, Spunk being one of them, which focuses on guys making their own goals around substance use. But then I also piloted a program in the last year, end of last year, called Safer PNP, which is an open drop-in for guys to discuss partying and safer partying strategies without any expectation for behavioral change, followed in the footsteps of Jordan Boncourt, who did a Kiki the program at ACT. And so to be able to connect with other service providers up on crystal meth and providing services for guys who use crystal meth is very important for me, and also contributing to a conversation that is so often in our community, we avert our gaze from the experience of using crystal meth, and to be able to contribute a compassionate lens to this conversation is extremely meaningful to me.
Thank you so much, Gavin. I'll turn things over to Elliot.
Hello, my name's Elliot. I'm a gay man living in Toronto. I've been abstinent from crystal meth for 20 months, but I lost many of my friends in my community when I made that decision. And it's really important to me to dream about what we need to create safe spaces where dialogue, conversation, better behavior, and how to interact with agencies and those trying to create spaces for us. You know, I don't want to do this alone. And even if it doesn't exist, that's okay. We can dream and make things better. I'm really passionate about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elliot. I will turn things over to Kiffer to give us his introduction and also to tell us a little bit about the project itself that we're speaking about today.
Thanks, Jordan. I'm Kiffer Card. I'm a research fellow at the University of Victoria's Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, and also an adjunct professor with the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University. And my connection to this work is largely, you know, I started my PhD and the focus of my PhD research was about online apps and websites and the impact they've had on shaping how we connect to one another as, you know, gay, bi, and queer men. And looking at that impact on things like behavior, sexual behavior, substance use, mental health. And that was about in 2016 when the opiate epidemic started to hit. And so that's what really pulled me towards substance use research and wanting to just understand what I could do to help, you know, what research we could do. And I found in a lot of cases, there wasn't a whole lot researchers could do. That the community already had a lot of the answers about what needed to be done to address these issues, and that the work was going to be just simply to amplify community voices. And in kind of the midst of my exploration of understanding substance use, you know, substance use research, I started to focus on crystal meth research because so much of the both the research and, you know, what was in the media about people who used crystal meth was very dehumanizing. And I found that it was just constantly kind of being offended at the way that people are portrayed if they use crystal meth, both from within the gay, bi, queer communities across Canada and especially from the outside. And so that really got us thinking about what could we do to improve kind of some of the messaging. And we thought, well, you know, community-based research and trying to amplify those voices was really the way to go. And so we sought funding from the Canadian HIV Trials Network, which traditionally, if you're familiar with the CTN, they have historically worked in the sphere of developing clinical trials for drug trials, usually for, you know, treating HIV. And their interest in the project was that we wanted to talk about the lack of programming and the lack of services available to members of our community who use crystal meth. And in BC, there was historically a one group that kind of focused on it, but that had like long been defunct. And so there were basically no services available that were tailored or appropriate for our community. And so that's where this project really came from, is to figure out, okay, if we're going to set up a program through, you know, a community health center like Three Bridges Community Health Center, if you're familiar with that in BC, yeah, that was kind of our vision. Is like, but we don't want to, as researchers, just go in and decide what that program is going to look like and what that intervention is going to look like. And so this program was really set up to get us all of that information about what community members thought were appropriate. How did they think about abstinence? How did they think about intervention that meant to help them change their substance use? And who would that help and who would that not help? Because some people just aren't ready to change. And so that's what this report really focuses on. And it does so by focusing on kind of 5 main sections. The first section of the report looks at patterns and motives for crystal methamphetamine use. And that's important because people use meth for different reasons: for social connectedness, for the experience of getting high, to deal with physical or emotional limitations around sex, to just have a good time, to have fun, to connect. And so those various reasons and motives and paths by which people find crystal meth, we really believe that that's an important aspect of, you know, why people use meth, and to understanding where they would be ready and what their, you know, stage of readiness would be in terms of actually making changes, or whether they, you know, were never going to want to make changes. And so the second section kind of started to explore that with identifying what are the gaps in services and supports. And, one of the big things we found is there's virtually no services and supports. And so the gap is more of a chasm than just a gap. And then, we kind of move in and talk about healthcare and harm reduction preferences, which I think is one of my favorite sections of the report, because I think it's like taking very simple design features and asking people what they want out of those programs. And it's what you see is like the development of what I think looks like a pretty strong and sturdy and rigorous program, and something that in the future we'll look forward to actually piloting to providing the sorts of services and supports we need. But then all of that is really capped off with these discussions about the role of trauma and stigma, that no service is going to work unless we account for the histories of trauma, and persecution and discrimination that have been enacted both within our community against people who use crystal meth, but also from outside our community and kind of the heterosexist, patriarchal, capitalist society we live in. And so, kind of recognizing that, we take all of that, we developed what we hope would be some good recommendations for adjusting crystal methamphetamine use. And that's really what we're pushing forward with now, as we move into more of an implementation stage and thinking about what can we actually do now within health services with this evidence as the supporting basis by which we can leverage to get funding from funders and engagement from health authorities. And so I wanted to thank Jordan and all the others who helped not only throughout this process, they've been key partners in helping recruit participants for our survey and getting the information out, and in really driving the work forward. So I think I can't really take credit for any of that wonderful stuff. I appreciate the Gay Men Sexual Health Alliance for their work in doing that, and the Community-Based Research Center as well here, which is focused more in the West.
Skipper for that background. And one of the things I love about this report is it's a living document. We can use it now. We don't put it up on a dusty shelf and forget about it. We can use it. It's got a lot of really great recommendations. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's in the email inviting you to the webinar. So take a look at it. We're going to move into the panel discussion. We've got about 50 minutes set aside for questions. I'm going to go through a couple of things very quickly with the audience, and then we'll get started. So we've got about 2 to 3 minutes for each panelist to respond to the question. We're only going to get to about 2 or 3 panelists per question. And then we're going to take some audience questions right after we've heard from the panel about the question at hand. So it'll be question and answer after every question I address the participants, the panelists. Just a reminder, and this is something I've had to learn, which is great questions are not statements and great questions are not stories. Make sure it's a question that's salient and about the topic at hand. Any outstanding questions that you have, please don't feel like if you don't get your question answered that it's too bad, so sad. You can reach out to me directly. My email will be at the end of the call, and I can either connect with the panelists directly, or you can address the question to me, and I'd be happy to address them for you. So panelists, are we ready to go? Okay. All right, we're going to start with question number, I guess it's question number 2. We're going to be skipping over the 1. And this is really about the report speaks to harm reduction services needing to be affirming and accessible to LGBTQ2S men who use crystal meth. So I'd like to know what that means to you as either a service provider, a peer, or a participant. And I'm going to start off actually on this one with Elliot, if I don't mind, for that maybe peer experience.
Hi, Elliot back. I'm really interested to talk about the stop and the start of programming, or the availability of supplies. So an agency can move them or can close their door. And certainly in the context of COVID-19, there have been sort of disruptions to where you go. And certainly as someone who wanted to use harm reduction supplies, if it's behind a glass door and it seems imposing, I've taken moments where I've walked up and down that block 3 or 4 times, depending on the time of day or night, and I won't go in there, and I'll just go, okay, what are my other options? And as soon as you start to sort of float the idea of other options, you've sort of missed some opportunity. And if I've experienced that as someone who's confident, who is able to walk into buildings, I'm sure there's other people. And certainly as someone in recent days and weeks have seen people scurrying past in shameful sort of like, if you watch their body language, there's a shame attached to using these supplies. And I think that that's sort of really missing it. I also want to just speak to the fact that harm reduction seems quite an institutional speak, and harm reduction is also what we do peer to peer. It's in what we talk to one another about our supply chain, about do we have stock, how do we dispose of, you know, needles or the bongs or whatever it is, the paraphernalia that we're using. And rather than it being a top-down idea, really, I'd like to encourage agencies and we as a community to start to speak about harm reduction as a movement towards how we treat one another with care, compassion, and love. And it's in every exchange by every member of the community in their decisions about sleep, about what their limits and boundaries are. And yeah, I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that response, Elliot. I really appreciate that. I'm going to turn things over to Gavin for your response.
Yeah, I just wanted to also just add to what, to affirm and also acknowledge what Elliot said in terms of making harm reduction supplies immediately, accessible is really essential. I think affirming and accessible can mean many different things, but in terms of guys who use meth, services that acknowledge and validate and affirm and recognize the reasons and function that meth has in the lives of people through the service, because substance use and meth use is an enduring reality in the lives of queer men. And so why is that? And understanding the reasons. And guys mentioned that T and Tina make them feel confident, sexually able to connect, escape the challenges of everyday living, feel alive, and cope with trauma, and just some of and pleasure. These are some of the reasons why guys use meth. And so acknowledging, sometimes we place a focus on the harms and the risks, and that's, our deliverables are meant to maybe sometimes zone in on those things, but then in the actual spaces of our group, how do we affirm and acknowledge and validate the pleasure and the positive experiences that and the function that these things have, that drugs have in the lives of queer men in a truly non-judgmental and affirming way. And that honesty allows for people to kind of truly be themselves in the space. In other services where there's a prescription, a moral prescription on what they should do, and usually that righteous or moral prescriptions about reducing use or stopping use, and that can create this fixation on the morality of it can create shame, and that is a barrier towards truly making choices and coming from yourself. So that is important, and in terms of validating the experience, and then in terms of accessibility, it's a different topic where, at least in the COVID context, in-person programming is impossible, but online programming is very possible as well. And online programming actually matches sometimes the ways that guys connect, and it is somehow less intimidating to maybe enter a space online where you can have code names, you can take your camera off, and you can remain anonymous, truly, because obviously we live in a drug prohibitive society, and we live in a society where there's drug hierarchies. So, meth and alcohol are on sometimes opposite spectrums, even though alcohol can be very destructive as well. So there's this element of ensuring that confidentiality is in the space, because disclosing that you use meth can be very intense, and doing that through an online means by having the anonymity embedded into the group norms, as well as creating structural things like code names or taking the camera off to ensure that people feel safe entering the space.
Great, thanks so much, Gavin. I appreciate that. You know what? We're going to go on to Shafiq. Did you have anything you wanted to add to this question, or any insight you wanted to share? You're good? Okay. So we'll open it up to questions from the audience. We'll take about 1 or 2 questions. Remember, first come, first serve. Chris, I'm leaving it up to you to identify who goes first. So if anybody has any questions, use the raise hand feature, or any comments, I guess. Ooh.
So far, there are no hands raised.
Okay, you guys obviously did a good job addressing that question. We'll give it another moment or so, and we'll move on to the next question. Okay. Oh, we've got a question. Rui.
Hi. I'll turn my camera Hi, so I just wanted to ask, so what are some of the common things that you find you're helping people with that they, besides accessing supplies, is there other things that you're helping people with in terms of what, is there a common pattern emerging there that people are looking for?
Who on the panel would like to address that question?
I can. Hi, Rui.
Hi.
It depends on the program as well. For example, in a harm reduction, exchange of supplies, it can be very simple. But when it depends, like in the space of spunk, there, where folk are looking at goals around changing, something relating to their substance use as directed by themselves, it can look like creating space for them to kind of reflect on the ways in which they can, the ways that use manifests in their life. And so it is different in the sense of some folk who want to reduce their use are maybe looking at other strategies to find other means of fulfilling the needs that the use brings to their lives. So that might mean community, or it might mean the fulfillment of sexual intimacy, and how does that look like with or without use. Then there is in a context like, say, for PNP, where it's just talking about how to manage overdoses, or how to how to navigate the unique complexities of a party, in terms of how to take care of the host and make sure that the host doesn't kick you out, or what to do when somebody might be new to substances, and how to support them in the space, or how to support each other, how to navigate boundaries in certain contexts relating to partners, and also how to things relating to supply as well, like how do I get how do I get access to supply? How do I conversate with my drug dealer? So these are all like things that are beyond the supply delivery thing, that are, there's a whole spectrum. Every single, as Elliot was mentioning, like every single part of a night can be discussed and shaped, and guys often talk to each other about many of these things on their own. And so it brings into that point also of like having peers involved, so that it is coming from a peer focus, and not an institutional focus, which can sometimes feel like, our community is sometimes used to or has an experience of mistrust with institution because of the stigmatized perspective that institution might have on meth. So it's I hope that answers some of your question.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin, for that answer. And it's a nice segue actually into the next question, is about stigma. So is there a relationship between trauma and stigma around crystal meth? And if so, how do you see them interacting? It's a two-parter. So if so, how do you see them interacting? And number two, which is, what can service providers do to better address that interaction? So how can we be more cognizant of that? For this one, I'm going to start off with Shafiq, if that's okay. Are you okay with that, Shafiq?
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, I definitely see a big connection between the two of them. For me, stigma is the first thing that's tangible. I think it's the easier one out of the two to sort of be like, oh, I understand stigma, I can grasp stigma. I've seen it in mental health or HIV, and it's driven by silence and fear. But it was an easier one to sort of grasp onto. While trauma, they're smaller acts, they're in repetition, they're ancestral, or they're part of our community. And for me, I didn't have as much access to the trauma part, or I didn't recognize my own internal trauma that was related to this. And because of the silence and the fear from stigma, I wasn't approaching any of the trauma stuff. And what has worked for me with the service provider is that, they're sitting down and sort of like, great, like, let's talk about your trauma. Let's see where some of that sits in. And how are we going to heal those pieces, because those are the pieces that I didn't have access to. And as I was dealing with my trauma, or I'm still dealing with my trauma, the stigma becomes less, because I'm like, oh great, there's a more internalized, it's something I now understand, have control over. While with stigma, it's sort of like external, like it's what you were saying about me, but the trauma is my trauma and I can understand it. And I think having a service provider to sort of almost like a rainbow of chart and said, great, here's all the trauma stuff. What do you see? What rings true to you? And then let's talk about it. And then also allowed me to be part of the solution. So here's what we're doing. What works for you? What would you want to try? And as an artist, like dancing or art is sort of where my therapy came in from. And that's where my focus was. So I think having the service provider help me recognize the trauma and then allow me to be part of my own solution, as opposed to saying, here is what we've done previously. Those were very helpful for me.
Great, thank you, Shafiq. Kiffer, would you like to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I think this is a critical consideration as we do all this work. As I mentioned, a big part of the report does look at trauma and stigma and its role in impacting how people access health services and supports. And I think one of the critical findings that we discussed with participants was just how stigma and trauma were mutually reinforcing. A lot of people would appear into a healthcare provider's office and they would try to hide their trauma, because when you're dealing with somebody who's got 50 years of education under their belt and they're like experts and they're hot shots, right? Like there is this societal demand and expectation that you put up that version of your best self, and so that can actually be a huge barrier to care, in that you're kind of ashamed of the trauma that you've experienced, and that's a really critical issue that has to be overcome. And I think that's one of the reasons why we think peer-based supports are so beneficial, is because people can let some of that guard down. There's an understanding that this person experiences what I experience, and that's a powerful remedy to stigma and trauma. And so because it shows people that they have the opportunity to connect on that basic level. And that was one of the key findings from both our interviews and validated by the survey results, is we see that people really wanted the social support and connection. They wanted staff members who understood them, both in terms of they understood their sexual orientation, sexuality, they understood what it was like to use crystal meth and why they use crystal meth. So having people who kind of went through that thing was one of the biggest programmatic design characteristics that participants advocated for to us. And so I think that's something that we need to take home and think about, that who we are and who our health providers are really influences how those experiences of trauma and stigma manifest. Even if you've designed your program to be, anti-stigmatic, like those inherent cultural and embedded aspects of our experience with healthcare is inescapable. And that's especially true for key groups of our community, people of color who've had historically very negative experiences in some cases with the health system, with social systems and social services. And so I think I would tie this to what can providers do? Providers need to take a step back, putting more work in the hands of even nurse-led programs, community-led programs, and peer-led programs, I think is really something that we're looking forward as a way to escape some of the, because some of those underlying traumas. And then, figuring out what programming works to actually address those directly and head on, which, is always this kind of delicate negotiation of trust has to be built before you can really start to, address experience of trauma head on.
Well said, Kiffer. Thank you so much for sharing that. And as a queer person who spent some time in very straight rehab centers, I can tell you my trauma was very activated in those spaces a lot of the time. Very hard to find healing when you're not amongst your community and people who share that similar life journey. So just to illuminate that. To Elliot or Gavin, do either of you want to tackle this question or have anything to add? Elliot, I know that Elliot's got a fire alarm going off in his building, so I'm going to leave him off of this one. So Gavin?
Yeah, I mean, what Kiffer was saying, that, and he worded it so perfectly, was the reinforcing, or they interact, and one interacts with the other, and that, I forget the word that you use, but and so really it is like you can become re-stigmatized and re-traumatized in spaces of service as well. And a lot of queer, I think it's worth noting that a lot of, again, just acknowledging the trauma that's rooted behind not always, but like sometimes rooted behind use. In terms of, queer men, we haven't had the opportunity to experience childhood in the same way as our straight counterparts. We don't get the first kiss in our high school. We probably get it maybe later, or we don't get to experiment until in university. We maybe experiment, or college, or wherever we experiment later on in life. And we have to do these things in adulthood when we have responsibilities. And so there is elements of use becomes a gateway to just shortcut ourselves into this experimenting free spirit zone of our childhood. And so there's this element of acknowledging that there's a real function relating to trauma, or a real function relating to living in a heteronormative society and a drug prohibitive society where it's going to be we're going to be stigmatized for either using specific drugs. So acknowledging these things within services really allows for people to, again, free up this defensiveness around feeling targeted by the world.
Thanks, Gavin. So we'll open up to the floor for questions. Just remember, the question on the table is about the relationship between trauma and stigma. Are there any questions from our audience?
No, there are no hands raised at this moment.
Don't be shy, folks. We don't bite.
Oh, actually, we've got Kirill. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So in regards to what everything's being said right now, I think is very important, and I'm happy to see that this is being shared. But when we talk about trauma and stigma, and with the pandemic that we're going through right now, that being on its own a new form of trauma that's being imposed on the community, how would you suggest that we handle that situation? Because very often here in the Durham region, a lot of users are predominantly using in isolation on their own because they're bored, and it's something that they've just been wanting to try, and we're seeing an increase in that. How would we work with that in ensuring to reduce the trauma from the pandemic as well?
Good question, Kiro. Who would like to field that one out of our panelists? It's a tough one.
Go again if nobody wants. I can go again. So I mean, that's something that me, as in my role, like thinking about a lot in terms of how do we connect and continue to connect with queer guys. And it's sometimes it feels like trial and error, where we are, creating a COVID campaign at ACT. We created a COVID campaign that had a PNP related segment so that, discussed if you're experiencing disconnection from your supply, how do you navigate using a loan or strategies, calling an overdose line in that circumstance, so that, you're not, in case you overdose or in case there's an issue, you have some sort of support. So we, providing a resource in that way, but also, again, connecting online is really the only vehicle that we can reach out in our communities sometimes in this time. So having a drop-in or a support space that, is that folk can, maybe it's a Zoom call where folk can access in case they're looking for support, specifically around PNP or using meth or substance use, is really great means. If you don't already have online spaces, considering that it's a great thing. Or doing even online outreach. And so we pivoted. I usually do bathhouse and bar outreach, but we pivoted by doing online outreach and in off hours. And so sometimes we're still trialing how best to connect with guys who party and play in online means. Sometimes people say passive approach versus, the other approaches, but just, off hours in terms of the evening where guys may be looking to cruise and having imagery within your profile to kind of that speaks to communities is kind of one of the ways. But yes, Jordan has something to say there too.
No, I was just sharing in the text chat something for after, but just to really reemphasize what our participants are saying, which is, not shaming people. Elliot, you have something you'd like to add? Go for it.
Yeah. I was familiar with Zoom before the pandemic hit, purely because I used online with other people. And so I was very familiar with the platform. And I think you'll find as service users, as people that party and play, we're quite resilient and we're quite resourceful, and there is a community. And I think we can try and encourage amongst ourselves for people to be accountable, to make sure that you are connecting. I'm going to be using now. Can you check in on me? You know, share your telephone number and contact details. And we just try and sort of like percolate this information to the wider population to know you will be using alone. And again, to sort of reinforce what Jordan has said, is don't shame, sort of encourage connection. And I think that we live in an era of fear from being criminalized, and we have to start shifting towards enforcing and encouraging connection without that sort of shadow of fear of persecution.
So well said. Thank you, Elliot. Really great question, Kira. Thank you for bringing that to the table. I hope you got some insight there, or some different perspectives. I'm going to move on from the Q&A around this question so we can, in the interest of time, just so we can stay on schedule. It's going to be another trauma question, and this one is going to be a little bit more specific. So when we were coming up with our webinar title, we talk about the harm is in the way that we're helping or not helping. Stigma and trauma can be reinforced through the services that we're providing, which we sort of touched on in the last question. So some help can be harmful to some people. What I'd like us to do is to think about the experience of BIPOC people or other cultures in white spaces that use maybe Western psychiatry or medicine as a reproach to working with guys who use crystal meth. And thinking about intersectionality in that regards, what are the harms that can come from services in this sort of aspect? I really worded that question badly. But we're talking about intersectionality, stigma and trauma, and how services can reinforce that, and what can we do to change that. Shafiq, I'm going to throw it over to you first, if that's okay.
Thanks, Jordan. I think at the very base root of that is like, don't make the answers homogeneous. Don't give me a solution that you think has worked for somebody else to start with. A lot of, the harms for me were like, great, like here's something that's already worked for somebody else. Great, this person wasn't the same culture, didn't have the same background. While yes, it was a great solution for that person, I think, engage me in your conversation, engage me in what here's what's worked in the past. How does that work for you? Allow me to be part of that conversation in my own recovery or in my own journey, wherever I am in it. I think, that at the very least is the first harm, where you're like, great, I already have a solution for you. Sometimes I also don't I don't want you to provide me a solution. I just want to be part of a conversation with you. I want to talk to you about it. And I think in the conversation is where I would break down what my cultural background is, or what my culture, my immigration, any of those parts that come with me. And I think also one of the things that, like, building safe space, I think, we've talked about this idea that I want to be in a space that's safe for me. And that sort of takes a bit of time. And also it depends on where I am in my journey. Maybe if I've just come out of a weekend of usage, and I may not be as conversant at that moment. And so maybe I'm more happy to sit and just observe the information or to be part of the conversation. But I think allow me to be part of the conversation and don't make it a homogeneous answer, I think is at the very basic is a great starting point, because one that tells me you're listening to what I'm saying and I'm part of this solution. And we all don't, like, one of my biggest concerns is not the right word, but my gifts were that, like, I would show up in these rooms and I'd be the only brown skinned person there. Meanwhile, I know I'm not the only brown skinned person in the playrooms, but in this space of a healthier education or harm reduction, I was usually the only person there for a while. So the conversations were very steered one way. Luckily, I've been allowed to be part of the conversation in my own journey. So yeah. You're muted.
I did not mute myself on that one, so somebody muted me, I swear. Kiffer or Gavin, would either one of you like to field this question?
I think maybe just one thing that I might add to that, because I think it's really important that we individuate people's experiences and allow them the opportunity and space to tell their stories, And there are certainly there are approaches to providing healthcare that emphasize this, like motivational interviewing. But there are also very popular approaches, psychotherapy and things that do emphasize like more of a physician or clinician directed approach. And so, I don't think this is the space to debate the merits of these various approaches, but I think like allowing the person to kind of guide the clinician through how they need the services they need is really critical and important. And I think that speaks to just, in order for that to happen, you first have to have the full spectrum of services available. One quote that's featured in our report and that we put forward in social media quite a bit was somebody telling an example of how their provider didn't believe in harm reduction, right? And it's just like that sort of stuff is just like insanity to hear in this day and age. Like, harm reduction, there is clear-cut consensus in the academic community around this. It shouldn't be a matter of somebody's opinion over what services they want to provide. And I think, making sure that we provide that full spectrum of services and then guiding and triaging people to the services that they're most ready for without, those preconceived notions is really kind of critical and important. And I see like now more than ever, I'm seeing that take place in queer men's health organizations where we're developing out kind of this robust set of options, and so that's really good, but there's still a lot of work to be done before I think we're really hitting the mark.
Great, thanks, Kiefer. And Gavin?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge the resilience and the strength that you demonstrated, Shafiq, in terms of entering spaces where sometimes you were the only brown person in the room. And often that just mirrors the experience of so many people of color, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color that, enter into spaces and are the only person of color in that space, specifically when it's a service about substance, supporting in substance use in any capacity. And so, when we're looking at creating these programs, there's an equitable lens that we need to have in terms of different races, different groups of people have different needs that are completely unique to their experience, as Kiefer was also mentioning, individuating, your work. And so having people of those experiences, people of color, leading and supporting those programs, being peers and having that intentional effort to recruit and engage as a company, organizational policy, or having frameworks that support that work, whether it even be a committee in your organization that ensures that BIPOC needs are being met, specifically so that those folks are recruited or are included into the space. Because of course, if I'm the only person of color in the room, I will feel that will shut me down. The power dynamics are at play, and that there's also an element of feeling misunderstood. And yeah, like there's the intersectional experience of being a person of color. For a person who uses substances, and then be queer plus a person of color. There's the compounded experiences of isolation, and then added on that, experience of being fetishized or challenging experiences around desirability. These are all compounded, amplified for persons of color. If they're a newcomer, there's even more greater barriers to finding any community, and sometimes P&P might be the one way, but you're even isolated in the P&P community. So there's just a lot of unique factors that need to be thought about and truly acknowledged and validated, and infrastructure needs to support those communities. And so, I hope that highlighted a bit of like what that intersection might be like and the need.
Well said, Gavin. Thank you. Any questions or comments from the audience on this topic? I just want to play the Jeopardy theme music right now. That little, oh, Barry, go right ahead.
Hello. I'm curious, I would like to know sort of if anyone can touch on what some of the sort of subtle barriers that we as service providers might be creating without realizing it. I know as a queer person, I've been in spaces with the most open and accepting people, but then they say something or they do something that raises that little red flag that might sort of make me think maybe this isn't the space for me, you know. And I'm wondering what those might look like for men who use crystal meth, like what some of those sort of more subtle unconscious bias things might be.
Great question, Barry. Who'd like to field that on the panel? Shafiq?
I'll go first. I mean, in my experience, I think the first, my first reaction to most of the things are rage or anger, and having the service provider not respond back with like kitty gloves at that point, or like kitty gloves is the best way to sort of say it, is helpful. Where they're like, okay, great, like, instead of backing up, like, great, sounds like you're angry, tell me more about this. It was really helpful, because I think for me, in the very beginning, like my emotions were just sort of like not my emotions, but my feelings were matched, right? So I'm feeling something, and the moment you said something that didn't agree with me in the moment, I got mad and angry about it. And really, in hindsight, it was just me going through emotions or feelings, but having you being like, okay, good, I will just avoid the question, wasn't always the answer. So I think understanding that if I come in today, it may have been after a weekend of use, but a week later, if I've got some rest, I have the ability to answer things differently or engage differently with you. I mean, hangry is a real thing, but also hangry in PNP is a real thing. Like, I haven't eaten, I haven't slept, I'm hangry as F. But I think, having a service provider who doesn't look at me right away and be like, great, here comes the angry brown man, but it's like, great, I feel like for me, the best response is I was like, okay, great. Do you want a glass of water? Are you hungry? Like, I feel like I always want to feed somebody right away when I find out that's happening. And once I've eaten and drank, then I'm in a better space to approach it in a nicer way. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thanks, Shafiq. I know Elliot wanted to chime in on this one. So Elliot, take it away.
Hi, I've got two ideas on this. I lived in transitional housing, and there was moments in that experience where the loudest and the most in crisis got service over the person that was quiet and more reserved. And it often felt that when I was in that space and a little bit more contemplative, that I really didn't get the service that I needed in that moment. And I think being a man in that moment, I was meant to do it alone. Although I was in transitional housing, I needed support, and it didn't always come. And the second part to that is I've experienced in multiple agencies where people have been very enthusiastic about help up front, but there have been moments where they've underdelivered or missed deadlines or not been available for an appointment. And as someone in crisis, you've burnt that bridge, and it's really, really difficult to get back to someone who's in crisis. You're burnt, and I don't trust you now. And so how do you build a meaningful relationship on those cinders? So just be systematic about your approach to helping clients. And then it's to be, if you've set an appointment or a date, I know us as users can time warp and be a little late, but if you as a service provider really want to make meaningful connections with people, stick to the time, deliver, don't make holidays, don't disappear, don't have a meeting, don't have a phone call or be late from lunch, because it really matters, and you can't repair those broken relationships.
Thanks, Elliot. Kiffer?
Yeah, I think one thing that I've heard from people of color is that they don't need timid supporters. They don't need coded language, everyone's welcome here, that sort of thing. They need kind of out front, in your face. It needs to be apparent. If people who come to your organization don't know that you support them, whether it's because they're trans or non-binary or they're a person of color, then you're not going to provide them the service and supports they need. And we're all going to make mistakes, and everyone recognizes that there's some cultural differences. There's lots of differences if you're a newcomer, if you're a person of color, if you're trans, whatever. And people will be forgiving of that if they know you and they know that you're an organization that is upfront doing that sort of work. And so it can't just be kind of a background part of the way that you program or approach. It can't just be subtle. It has to be very apparent to core who you are. So if you're a gay men's health organization or a clinic, it needs to be totally apparent that you have programming, that you have intentionality, that you care about this population and its well-being. And if you don't have that, then I think everything else gets rockier from there on out.
Well said, Kiffer. Rui, you had a question as well?
Sure. Has anyone aware of any programs where peers are talking to peers in a people of color context, like a specific ethno-specific context? Has that actually happened?
If I can just, I know that I think Garfield's in our audience, and I know Black Cap's doing work around that. If Garfield wanted to address that, you're more than welcome to, but I don't want to put you on the spot, Garfield. If anybody else wants to field that as well, I'd welcome comments from anybody in the audience or our panel.
Okay. I haven't seen it in any organizations. I mean, outside, let me take that back again. The Save a PNP, Gavin was the first person of color that I saw, like, oh, this is the first place that I found someone brown skinned I could speak with. But a lot of conversations for me have happened in the groups with the community. So maybe not in a service organization place, but like Elliot was saying, a lot of our conversations happen while we're high in our rooms or with each other. And that's where I find most of the stuff up, because when you're high, there's less shame and there's less stuff attached there. But outside of that, I don't think I've seen any peer-to-peer. I haven't seen a peer-to-peer model outside of that. Again, minus Save a PNP for me.
For me, it's similarly, like I can't think of, well, I can't think of one, which I'm not sure if it's people of color focused, but I think Pieces to Pathways often does a lot of specific, especially during July and June of last year, they had harm reduction drop-ins that were BIPOC focused, and so that it was prioritizing people of color in that space, specifically Black folk, and so that's an incredible footsteps to follow. That Pieces to Pathways and then the GMSH, but they do incredible work for queer people, and in terms of harm reduction, the other kind of model that isn't harm reduction based, but Max Ottawa does, which is Keeping It 100, which is a by and for Black queer men, men who love men, same gender loving men, to connect about various topics relating to identity, experience living, being queer. And that's a really great model in terms of having BIPOC exclusive programming.
Great. Thank you for that question, Rui. So we're at the 3 o'clock mark. We have about 15 minutes left and we have closing to do, but I wanted to throw one question out that's not on my list of questions. So I'm going to surprise my panelists by asking them a question, which is, where do you think we go from here? What is the next step that you see as being the most important step for us as service providers to take? So I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to answer it. You're not obligated to because it's a surprise, but anybody want to field that one? This is why you don't surprise your panelists with questions. Elliot, go ahead.
Hi. We dream about what it is that we want. And we often look to London or to South Africa and to other organizations to follow suit. But I really think that there is a capacity in this moment in history where we can actually create it, because it can be done online. And I think the second part of this is, if you create it, you've got to make sure that it's got runway. So it doesn't just happen for 3 or 4 weeks, that it's fully funded, that you can make it realize it can evolve in its sort of formation, but it's a 6-month, a year plan so that people can reliably turn up, they can count on it. Because when things are offered and then take away, I tell you, yeah, it burns the bridges. And I think it needs that kind of vision and that kind of belief and multiple agency buy-in to realize it. And it may not have to be run by the agency, it can be floated by an agency, but it can be run by peers who are volunteers. And that's certainly something I'd be interested in facilitating or helping to create. Thank you.
Great answer, Elliot. Thank you, Shafiq.
Yeah, I'm going to echo actually what Elliot said. I think this idea that like we're in a time and space where we don't actually have to be all in Ontario or in Toronto. Like we don't have to be downtown. We are allowed, we can pull our resources together. One, like a solution rather than having 4 different groups show up, one in Durham, one in Peel, one in like, just have one, and you can all fund in at different quarters for it. But the idea that the program gets to continue, you know, the meth and sex group at ACT is, I find really helpful for me, because I went to the program, and now I'm part of like a alumni program that as people come in, you know, we're like, it's been 2 years, but it's a space that I can go back in. I feel comfortable and feel safe. And I think even just like having this conversation, Info PNP on Facebook is great. It's a space where we are allowed to go and tell our stories. And in those stories, we're, I think, coming up with our own solutions, or we're creating new solutions, or creating modalities of health or that work for us. Yeah.
Thanks, Shafiq. Kiffer or Gavin?
Yeah, I can go. I mean, I'm just honored to even, for example, with the Safer PNP program, like I get to work with Elliot and Shafiq about, you know, various like just modeling an innovative program for guys who consistently always say that this is so needed, that they're, you know, excited to talk about it, and to have that continue is something that I'm really looking forward to doing. And the element is just kind of what's already happening is, you know, with Jordan's work in the GMSH and Matt's work in Max is just to kind of connect organizations to build skills and train and capacity for peers to lead this work. And so having that infrastructure there is just so essential. And the sharing of the resources that, you know, the resources are here in this call to do everything that we want to do. And so it's kind of connecting and not being afraid to connect and reach out to me or to anyone in terms of how we can better support each other. And the element of just, yeah, like creating that vision of and dreaming of what does this program look like within your organization, and where, and as soon as that dream is in place, the resources come. So yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. Shafiq, one more time.
So just something really, really quick. I feel like something that GMSH did really well was with the podcast, where, you know, we came in and our skills were recognized as lived experience skills to help with like, oh, you're the person who needs the service. It was like, great, you need the service, but also you're part of the solution. And I think even just that podcast where we all got together and speak about ourselves and speak about our experiences was such a great step in building capacity, empowering us to sort of move forward and tell our stories and be part of the solution again. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Shafiq. Kiffer, anything you'd like to add? Where do you think we need to go next?
I mean, I think echoing everything that's been said, I think the focus on peer-driven work, like to me, that's on the move, that's happening. And it's happening in many, you know, as Kara points out in the chat, you know, it's happening in lots of different organizations. I think just the emphasis and the mobilization around PNP is like, to me, I'm really hopeful for a lot of these things that I'm seeing in community happen. I think is where I worry, I guess, is where I'd focus this question on. The things that I worry about is kind of, you know, these short-term funding cycles that we're all stuck in. I think I worry that this will come and go and that it won't become a permanent part of programming, because it seems like the only way we can get a lot of funding attention is by using this kind of meth scare tactics that like the media plays into, that, you know, policymakers seem to like just latch their claws into. They like it. But in a lot of ways that brings about stigma. Like this needs to be a regular and ongoing part of programming for our community, because PNP isn't going away. We don't want it to go away. People are finding lots of meaning and connection through it. And figuring out how to do that balance of saying some people are being harmed by PNP and we want to help those people, and balancing that against some people are really fucking enjoying it and that we want to help those people too. I think that's the other balance we have to strike, and that has to be an ongoing thing. And hopefully that can be remedied, like by allying across organizations, figuring out what we can do to make things work and be sustainable. And I think that's where we're at. You know, we're not in, at least me as a researcher, we're not at the stage of figuring out you know, harms about PNP or that sort of thing. Like that's not where the work should be. It shouldn't be looking at psychological predictors of PNP or crystal meth use. Like I see a lot of that work still going on. I think the researchers need to move away from that and look at services and implementation and move into an era. So if you have partners that are researchers, or you have partners who are government and they're kind of emphasizing those sorts of things, shift to them to be like, no, we're in the era of implementation and we're going to try shit, see if it works. find out what doesn't, get rid of the stuff that doesn't work, and keep going on with the stuff that does.
If I were a religious man, I would say hallelujah right now, but I'm not. So thank you for sharing that, Kiffer. All very well said. I think that takes us to the end of our panel discussion. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for Q&A because I'm sure there are some questions in the audience that are percolating still, but I know everybody has to get back to work. So I do want to thank all of our panelists for doing a fantastic job. I will give you a silent round of applause because all of us clapping at once would be too loud. I want to thank you for your insight and your willingness and your passion. Really moved by a lot of what you guys shared. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us for 45 minutes. I invite everybody in the audience today to think about a single thing that they've taken away from today, and then apply what you've learned in your efforts to connect with guys who use crystal meth. There's nothing that we've heard today that can't be applied almost immediately in some small fashion, and that makes a difference. I want to remind the Alliance membership that I'm available to support you with all of your crystal meth related questions and more. My contact info is on the last slide. Please use me as a resource. I can't answer everything, but I know people who can. And I want to thank Shafiq for mentioning Info PMP. If you have clients or service users that are looking for a space to congregate online or looking to ask questions about PMP, but they're afraid to do so in a sort of face-to-face setting, Info PMP, it's administered by a peer. It's all peers. It's a private Facebook group that nobody else can know about. Not going to appear on your wall and your mom's not going to see it. It's private, it's confidential, and we've got 241 guys who are members of that group right now in the province. So please have them look us up. Fill out the evaluations that will be sent out following the presentation today. We welcome comments and questions and feedback about how to do things better. And I wish everybody a wonderful day. And I think that's